that was a problem last time. But I'm going to go ahead and just get started then. We are going to talk about verbal abuse and emotional abuse, what the difference is, and also a kind of communication that is still unpleasant and disconnecting and hurtful, but that doesn't necessarily fall under the category of abuse that I want to talk about. And then you can, oh, thank you, Michael. I'm glad you can hear me. Marie, thank you, and Mary. Is that better, Mary? Turn up the volume a little bit. So I'm going to break this down for you guys, and the purpose of this talk today is to clear up some misconceptions, draw a line between two kinds of abuse that are used interchangeably. There is some gray area. It's not a big thing to sweat, but I get this question a lot, like what's the difference between verbal abuse and emotional abuse, and how do I know if that's what's happening? How do I know if that's what I'm doing, or how do I know for sure that that's what my partner is doing? Where is the line? Because sometimes there is a type of communication that feels really bad and you walk away feeling confused and you wonder if it's abuse or not. And so what I want is to shed some light on that and give you not only an understanding just intellectually and theoretically about what the difference is, but then what you can do about it, how you can find alternatives for yourself if this is something that you're doing, and also how to sidestep it if your partner is doing it to you, to recognize what the maneuvers are, recognize what the things are, the actual tactics, the actual things that are happening, and then recognizing it ahead of time or being prepared ahead of time to not get triggered by it or get hooked in by it. Because a lot of times people get hooked in so quickly and then they don't even realize this is happening, and things have escalated before you even realize that you've made the choice to enter into a conversation that was set up to fail. So if you're aware of what these things are, then you can get ahead of it and recognize it when it happens and be prepared to step around it or to draw some lines for yourself. So let me just pull up my notes. And first I'm going to talk about what verbal abuse is. Hang on, guys. Now I can't find my notes. Okay. So verbal abuse is really specific tactics. It's the use of language to hurt another person. It's like crossing a line verbally. So how I describe it is, the use of language to hurt another person and speaking violently, and that also includes discounting. So it can be like a direct attack verbally, or it can be the use of language to completely undermine or discredit or deconstruct the premise of what the other person is saying, and that can be abusive as well. So this is real clear for most people. Name calling is obviously verbal abuse. Any name in the book is, anytime you're negatively name calling another person, that's verbal abuse. But it doesn't have to be just direct names. It can also just be negative labels, like a character label, like stupid or selfish, where you're broad strokes defining the character of the other person with words. That can be abusive as well. So that's pretty obvious. Most people are aware of that. When we think of verbal abuse, we know that that's what that is. The rest is not as clear, though, like, for example, condescension or sarcasm. So, a comment like, let me see if I can dumb this down for you. That's obviously a put down. It's sarcastic. The intention behind it is condescending. It's a superior stance that you're taking with another person, and you're putting them down with your language. If you say something like, okay, sorry, what is it that you don't understand? What is it that you don't understand about what I just said? In that kind of tone, that sort of harshness, that sarcasm can be used to hurt the other person. Now, this is on the fence. Like, you can use sarcasm in a lighthearted way. You can use sarcasm sometimes just to have a little bit of edge, and that you can do that in the relationship, and it's fine, right? It depends on what the rules of the relationship are. But I personally don't really like sarcasm. I don't like it when I see my kids doing it. I feel like it's a really slippery slope, and it's a way of not really owning what you're exactly saying. Sarcasm is a way of not fully taking ownership over the message that you're sending, and it's a way of almost pretending like you're not saying what you're really saying. and it can be used to hurt other people, whether you're aware of it or not. So sarcasm is often used in verbal abuse. Criticism is also verbally abusive because it's globalizing a person's character. It's not the same thing as a complaint. So if you complain, let's say you don't like something and you're complaining about it and you're just focusing on the thing at hand, just the thing that you're annoyed by, that's a complaint. But when you link it up with the person's character and say this is what they're always doing because they're lazy or because they're selfish or because they don't care about anybody else or because whatever it is that you believe about, whatever negative narrative you have about the person, if you are kind of connecting all the dots and globalizing about what this person is like and you're insisting on that, that is verbally abusive. I know we don't often think of criticism as verbal abuse, but it is, because it's literally like verbally berating another person and telling them negative things about themselves, and there's nothing constructive that comes from it. There's no purpose that it serves. It's not something that you can do anything with. It's not a request. It's not something you can't win, right? If you're being criticized, there's nothing you can do with that, except get defensive or try to explain and say, no, that's not really who I am. And people walk away from criticism feeling really battered emotionally. So, and this is common. I mean, you might be hearing this and thinking, oh my gosh, I do this. A lot of the things that I'm sharing, a lot of us do or have done, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're an abuser. Like, you can be a non-abusive person. You can be somebody who's trying the best they can, or your heart is in the right place. But if that's all you've ever learned, and that's the only way that you know how to protect yourself, or that's the only way that you know how to communicate, then you can't do better until you know better, right? An abuser is someone who has a need to be in control, who has a need to one-up you all the time. And you don't have to be an abuser to engage in verbal abuse. So there's no shame around this, except just to shine the light on it and say, this is not okay. This is not going to help. This is to be avoided. Direct put-downs obviously are verbally abusive. Saying things like, you're nothing without me, nobody would put up with you, really just putting down the other person's character. This can be done in a myriad of ways. You can be creative about this. You might have examples in your own relationship, but when the person is directly putting you down and saying that you're nothing, saying that you're less than, obviously that's verbally abusive. Another thing that's verbal abuse is just straight up screaming and yelling and super high intensity and expecting the other person to absorb that energy, even if what you're saying or what they're saying isn't about you. Like, because sometimes people will say, well, I was just really upset and it wasn't even about them. I wasn't mad at them. But if they're still expecting to yell and scream and have that person listen and give them their full attention and just receive that negative energy and absorb that, that's crossing a line. I think that that's abusive too. So even if it's not personal, even if you intellectually know this isn't personal, they just had a bad day or whatever, but if you're supposed to be like an open container for like just dumping and screaming and negative energy, that is not okay. That's verbal abuse as well. Whether it's an overt attack on the person's character or whether it's just venting about how bad something was at work. Threats are also verbal abuse. Saying things like, I'm going to hurt myself if you leave, or I'm going to call your boss and I'm going to tell them these things about you that are going to humiliate you. That's verbal abuse as well, because, and this is also a little bit of gray area, because this I would also put under the category of emotional abuse. Emotional abuse is not so much about tactics as it is about the intention behind it. And this is about control, right? Threatening to control the other person so that you can get what you want, even at their expense, at the expense of their willpower, at the expense of their autonomy, at the expense of their dignity. Anytime that you're getting threats that control you, and you feel that you have to go along with something because otherwise you're going to have to pay for it in the form of embarrassment or humiliation or some other horrible fallout. It might be the kids, like, I'm going to tell the kids this about you, or I'm going to tell them what you told me, or, something that would out you or make you feel exposed with people that wouldn't have that information otherwise. That's emotional and verbal abuse. So that's verbal abuse. There's 6 things: name calling, Sarcasm, which condescension I kind of put in that as well. Criticism, direct put downs, straight up yelling and screaming, and threats. That's verbally abusive. Now, emotional abuse, how I describe this is less about the use of language or tactics, and more about the intention to control or manipulate using somebody's emotions, using their sensitivities, using their vulnerabilities, using what you know about that person in order to control them with their emotions. That's what emotional abuse is. And it's usually to get what you want, and it's not in their best interest. So, for example, a guilt trip or shaming somebody into doing what you want is emotionally abusive. A lot of parents do this to their kids. They guilt trip their kids into doing what they want, wearing their hair a certain way, or dressing a certain way, or doing certain things for the parents, just because if you don't, you're going to be guilted and you're going to be made to feel like you're a horrible, selfish person. So guilt trips is an example. Threatening to do something humiliating, which I said also falls under the verbal category. This can be anything that you would deem as negative, that is designed to hurt you as a way of preventing you from doing something that you want to do, or trying to get you to do something that you don't want to do. That's emotional abuse. Also, isolating. This is an example of, well, maybe this isn't really a threat, but if you're isolating your spouse by causing a problem or a fight every time they go hang out with their friends, or if your partner is telling you really bad things about your best friend or your friends or your family, and making you second guess or causing drama every time they come around, and they're just not hanging out with their friends and family now just to keep the peace, I consider that emotional abuse as well. Making it so that they don't have any other source of information or input or stimulation or interaction or connection outside of you. And that's your need, but it's not their need, right? That's abuse. That isolation comes in emotional abuse. It also comes in the cycle of violence. Social isolation is a really big part of that. But it doesn't have to be. You can have isolation in an emotionally abusive relationship, even if you don't have the whole cycle of violence as well. But that is a big, big red flag. Acting, I think this is something I put this in here. If you or your partner is always acting unhappy and just vibing constant disapproval, and the message is, you're the reason that I'm so unhappy all the time because you're not doing anything right, I think of that as emotional abuse as well. Because you're creating a hostile environment. You're creating a biosphere, an energetic container that is communicating, it's not enough, this is really shitty, and it's all your fault. You know, that kind of attitude that can come from nonverbal communication, that can come from stonewalling, and I'm going to get into that in a minute. But it's just that constant disapproval. You know, like if you are trying to be recognized for something that you did differently, or you're trying to offer something positive or a value, and they just won't give you that satisfaction, or they won't ever let you know that you have positively contributed to something, or that you've added value in any way, I think of that as emotional abuse too. And another thing is not taking ownership and always deflecting. These kind of go hand in hand. So I could just say deflection, which you can't really deflect unless you're stepping out of taking full responsibility for yourself. So this can be turning the tables. You know, I wouldn't have been late if it wasn't for you. I wouldn't have done that if you hadn't done this, right? Just deflecting ownership constantly, saying things like, you know, you don't get to say anything to me about yelling at the kids when you yelled at the kids 2 months ago, right? Just turning the tables as a way of refusing to take ownership of whatever is being raised, changing the subject to get the heat off of you and onto them. This is obviously a defensive maneuver, and there's a lot of different defensive maneuvers that can do this. But I think that, and it's normal to be defensive. Like, everybody gets defensive sometimes. But what I'm talking about is chronically deflecting and always table turning, and never taking the feedback, and never hearing the validity of another person's concerns or feelings or observations, and constantly turning it back on the other person. I think of this as abusive because it erodes goodwill, and you're positioning yourself as an opponent, and it's just a countering, negative, rejecting intention. So if you're in doubt, you know, like is what I'm doing abusive, or do I think that my spouse is being abusive to me in these ways emotionally? What you want to get clear on is, what is the intention behind it? If the intention behind what they're saying is to deflect, or if the intention behind what they're saying is to get you to now defend yourself so that you don't have to like actually take accountability, that's not a connecting intention. That's not a loving intention. That is not an intention that would support a healthy partnership. Your intention is not to share your feelings. Your intention is not to reveal yourself or be transparent to the other person. Your intention is simply to counter or negate. And this happens all the time. Like, people do this all the time and they don't even realize that that's what they're doing. And so one of the things we're going to get into is how you can stop that in its tracks and ask the right questions to facilitate that self-reflection. If you're with a narcissist, if you're with like a full-blown narcissist or an abuser, nothing you say or do is probably going to make a difference, because their need for that control and one-upping is going to be stronger than their desire to self-reflect. But if it's just a blind spot and your spouse is just doing this out of habit, or you're doing it out of habit, well-positioned questions can catalyze, pausing and reflecting and going, okay, let me start over. That isn't what my intention is. I don't want that to be my intention, or I don't want to act from that intention. So until I can change my intention, I'm not going to say anything else. I'm going to get into that in a minute. The other thing that I see all the time is undermining or invalidating what your spouse is saying all the time. So it could be like saying things to your spouse for the purpose of showing them how ridiculous they sound or how ridiculous they are. Like, you're so sensitive. And if you feel that way, if you think that, if this is something that bothers you, then that's just ridiculous. That's petty. That is so small-minded. And you just trivialize their concerns all the time. You are trivializing what they care about. You are deciding that what they're concerned about or what they're raising or what they're saying at all is stupid, and you're just waving it away. And the intention behind it is to get them to stop. Like, I don't want to be held accountable, so I'm going to make you look stupid for bringing it up. Or it could be just because I get something out of actually putting you down, or because I'm uncomfortable with the part of me that I have to look at when I hear you bring that up. When you are owning something or you're sharing that something's bothering you, and I don't like the sensitive part of me, I'm going to judge you for the sensitive part of you that you're raising right now. So there's a lot of different reasons why these things happen. So you want to look at what's the intention behind it. That's what's going to tell you if it's abusive or not. The other thing that happens with emotional abuse is embarrassing you in public, making fun of you to the checkout person, or telling a joke at your expense with a group of friends. And this might happen inadvertently, like, oh, I thought you would think it was funny. Like, that can happen. But if you tell your spouse, that wasn't funny to me, I didn't like that made me feel embarrassed, and then you keep doing it, and you just tell them that they're being too sensitive and you think it's funny, that's abusive. It's abusive because if the joke is at their expense and it's about them and they don't think it's funny, then you're just putting your need to tell a joke about another person ahead of how that makes them feel. And there's actually no good reason to ever do that. There would never be a reason that would be okay, or that would be somehow more important in a healthy relationship to insist on telling a joke that I know you think is not funny at your expense, and then keep telling you that it's actually funny and that you just are too sensitive to understand how funny it is. Like, that really makes me mad when I see people doing that. The other thing that I think of as emotional abuse that is not overtly like attacking, but it's like refusing to give any understanding. If you see that your spouse or partner is trying so hard to be understood, they're trying really hard to explain if something is impacting them a certain way, or they're trying to share something about themselves, whether it's a raw spot or just something that happened to them that has nothing to do with you, and they're trying to be understood and you're just not going to give it to them. Like, you're going to not give them empathy, you're going to not understand them, you're going to act like you don't understand what they're saying. Chronically, again, this might happen as a one-off, but if it's something that's happening all the time, and if you are somebody that you notice every time you're trying to earnestly answer a rhetorical question and they're not going to actually hear your answer, or anytime that you are earnestly trying to put your best foot forward and have a healthy conversation and have a difficult conversation about something sensitive, and they're just not going to give you that understanding. It's like the withholding of connection, the withholding of giving you the thing that I want you, that I think that you want the most. That can be emotionally abusive if the intention is to keep the upper hand. If the intention is, I don't want to understand what they're saying, I don't want to give them the feeling of understanding them, and actually saying, you know, I hear what you're saying and that kind of makes sense. I can see where you're coming from. If you don't want to give that to the other person because that would give them power, or that would somehow make you wrong, if that's the reason why that you're not able to give that, then I think that's an abusive behavior, and you have to be very careful with that. This is also really big with narcissists, is just that chronic invalidation. Now, I think if you're really strong and you've healed the adaptive child within yourself and you have done your own inner work, you're not going to need your partner to validate you. You're not going to feel like you're putting your whole your whole sense of well-being into their hands. But still, what is the point? Why would you want to be super close to someone if they never understood what you were talking about? You know what I'm saying? How can they love you if they don't even understand what you're saying? So that's something to be aware of. This also kind of blends really well into the next point. The other way that emotional abuse comes up is gaslighting. People talk about gaslighting all the time, and I think people misuse this term. Gaslighting is when you are intentionally denying the reality of the other person, or making them question their own perceptions, and you know that it's true. That's what gaslighting is. Gaslighting is denying what you know is real. Now, if you're denying what you don't know is real, that's not the same thing as gaslighting. But if you know it's real, let's say you're lying to your spouse and you know that you did, and they're calling you on it, and you're just denying it and making them doubt themselves, that's gaslighting. It's basically just lying, but it's a chronic pattern of behavior that feeds, like the person is feeding off of the invalidation of the other person. So it's very pathological. It's not just a blind spot where it's like, oh, I wasn't aware of that. Wasn't aware of that. That's what I was actually doing, or I hadn't been honest with myself yet, so that's why I hadn't told you. That's not the same thing as gaslighting. Gaslighting is really intentionally denying what is real, chronically, and having no problem whatsoever with you questioning your sanity. And I think it's just really cruel and pathological. Like it can go into like the realm of being a sociopath if you're gaslighting all the time. But I do think people overuse this term. Not everybody that invalidates you is a gaslighter, and not everybody that doesn't understand what you're saying is a gaslighter. But somebody who's constantly denying, and you know for a fact, and you have proof, and you present them with proof, and they're still lying to your face, that's gaslighting. That's absolutely, clearly emotional abuse. Now, here's something else that I think of as emotional abuse that we don't often think of, which is the silent treatment and complete stonewalling. Now, sometimes people stonewall because they are scared of what's going to come out of their mouth, and it's the best they can do, right? But if you're stonewalling because you are trying to maintain the upper hand and you are trying to mess with your spouse, or because you are trying to retaliate, and they are doing everything in their power to try to reconnect with you or try to repair, and you're stonewalling for days at a time, that's emotional abuse, because you are ignoring the emotions, or you're being very careless and hurtful with the emotions of your spouse on purpose. This is just sometimes a lack of skill. So you have to ask yourself, is this something that I've done because it's just what I know, and I'm not trying to have the upper hand, I just don't know what else to do? I wouldn't say that that makes you abusive. But if it's something that you know is deeply hurtful, and you've been given alternative tools to use, and you're not using them, and you're not trying anything differently, and you're just choosing, then I think that is abusive. It is the comfort zone for a lot of people, but it's abuse. Also, I mentioned this one already, and this was the last one, which is that, continuing to make jokes that are hurtful. that basically it's not considerate at best and abusive at worst. Now, then I think that there's another category of communication that's destructive and disconnecting, that you can walk away from feeling like that felt really bad. I don't feel good about that, and I don't know why. And you're left wondering, like, I wasn't being name called, I wasn't being criticized, I wasn't being gaslit, but I'm walking away from that interaction feeling really bad. And so I kind of went through my mental list of things that I have noticed that come up that fall into this gray area that I think will be really helpful to recognize. And again, we're looking at the intention behind the communication, that is what matters the most. So one of the things that I do not engage in, this is a boundary for me, is I don't engage rhetorical questions that are designed to prove me wrong. So, and you don't always know if that's what they're for, but rhetorical questions can be in that gray area because they're not supposed to help you resolve something. They are to show you, like a rhetorical question would be something where it's like, did you or did you not do this thing? Like, did you or did you not leave the dishes out? Yes, I left the dishes out. Did you say that you were going to put them away? Yes, I did say that I was going to put them away. Okay, so was it that you decided to blow me off and not keep our agreement, or was it that you just forgot like you always do because you don't care? Like, do you see how the questions just led to a battering? Like, it's like I can guide you down this road with these questions that when you answer those questions, it sets me up. It's like a punchline. Rhetorical questions set you up to be smacked, basically, verbally. And so a lot of times. And so be on the lookout for that. If the question is not serving gaining greater clarity, if you don't know where the question is going, if you feel uncomfortable asking the question because there's a premise underneath the question that you don't agree with, especially if it's a yes/no question, it's like in a court of law, they have all the power asking the questions. You're forced to answer a question that you don't even agree with the premise of, so you lose no matter how you answer the question. So I would avoid rhetorical questions and be on the lookout for that within yourself. Sometimes people do that not because they're trying to be abusive, but because that's the only way they feel like they can prove a point, right? You're just trying to prove a point. You're just trying to be right. And that's where we're getting to, like, losing strategies. Losing strategies aren't necessarily abusive, but they definitely don't work, and they're not helpful, and they should be avoided. The other thing that I notice is, like, statements that will shut the conversation down, that are rejecting bids for connection. So for example, if you're sharing something about, let's say you're sharing something about your childhood with your spouse, you're driving and you see something outside and you're like, oh, this reminds me, and you share something, and you're sharing it from a place of wanting to connect or talk, and your spouse says something like, yes, I know, you already told me that before. You already told me that before, you don't need to tell me that again. It's just a complete shutdown, and it's a rejection of a bid for connection. It's not abusive. Like, it might be factually right, but what is the intention behind that statement? The intention behind that statement structurally is not connecting. And so this is where we get into fights with people, is because if let's say you do that and your spouse responds in that way, and you're like, well, that wasn't very nice. And then you want to try to show them what they did that was wrong, that hurt your feelings, and then they deny it because they feel like, well, I'm just saying what's true, right? But it's not a neutral observation. It's not a neutral observation. There is a reason the statement is being said, and it is to shut the conversation down. It is to say, I don't want to hear it again. I've already heard it. And so, because why else would you say it otherwise, right? Also, and this is the next thing as I was going to mention, is comments that sound like a neutral observation, but they're actually a judgment. Like, oh, you're late. It's like, that's not a big deal. That's not a huge thing, right? You can say that in a lighthearted way, but like, I'm just saying, hey, this thing, here's what I saw, and I'm just observing it, quote unquote, in a neutral way, but there's a reason why I'm saying, and I'm highlighting something that you didn't do right, or I'm highlighting something that you did wrong, or I'm saying something and I'm trying to pass it off like it's just a neutral observation, but there's a point behind it that I am not acknowledging. I'm not owning the reason I'm saying it, or they're not owning the reason that they're saying it. It's just subtle. It leaves you feeling not that good, but it's not something that you could necessarily put your finger on and say, you're being an asshole, right? Because you're not really, if you're just saying something that's actually factually true, but based on when it is said and based on the effect that it has on the conversation and based on what your intention is, that's how it's going to land. And that there is something behind that. So be aware of that inside yourself and notice when that's happening if your partner's doing the same thing. Let's see, what else? Defensive maneuvers, I talked about this before. If you are somebody, or if your spouse is somebody who is always turning the tables, always deflecting, always changing the subject, that's abusive. Like I said before, being defensive once in a while is not abusive. But if it's something that, if you know that every time I bring something up, every time I make a request, every time I share, if something had an impact on me, no matter how well I do it, no matter how lovingly I do it, the tables are going to be turned, that's abusive. That's emotional abuse. Examples of this are, obviously I use the example of table turning, but it can also be like, yes, but, or, well, I don't like it when you do this. So there, like, I'm just going to shut it down. It's just a complete rejection. It's a complete block. You're just constantly blocking what the other person is offering at a time when you actually could have a deeper connection. And that hurts the relationship. It can also be like just in the gray area if it's not chronic. This is the thing that I want you to be aware of. Maybe it's not chronic, but if it happens enough where you're just not feeling like you're in that ratio of 5-to-1 positive negative at least because of little things like this that are getting in the way, this could make the difference, between feeling like you have a solid connection and sometimes you're just not as connected versus things just don't ever feel that good. It's not like anything is really bad, but things just are not feeling very good right now. That's why I'm highlighting this right now. Also, I think globalizing character and insisting on a negative narrative about that person doesn't have to be abusive necessarily, but if you're insisting like, well, that's just how you are, and they're like, well, no, not always. Like sometimes recently I've been really making efforts in that way, and you're just insisting, no, that's just how. No, that's who you are. That is what you always do, and you're doing it you're not doing it to fight. But you're just insisting and you're telling them about them. That's a boundary violation. It's not necessarily abusive, but it's crossing a line. It's a losing strategy. It doesn't feel good and it's not constructive. And it actually generates defensiveness and hurts people's feelings. Also speaking for the other person, this is kind of along the same line when you're insisting on a narrative about that person and who they are. If you're making a lot of you statements, if you're speaking for their intentions, their goals, their reasons, their feelings, their thoughts, and I used to do this all the time. This is what I think you're doing. This is why I think you're doing it. And I'm pretty sure that's what's going on. Like, here's what's going on with you. Here's what your reasons are. And here's why you're doing that. That's not constructive, it's not connecting, it's not helpful, and it's not appropriate. It's not healthy. And especially if you need them to agree with you and will get upset if they don't agree with you. So notice that if your partner is talking to you about you, speaking to you about your desires, your intentions, your reasons, your logic, then you can just, draw a line and say, please tell me what's going on for you right now. What is it that means to you? What is going on for you? And just flip it back so that you don't get pulled in. Because if it's not abusive, if it's not heavy-handed, it's a very slippery slope to then want to correct that. And then if they won't take the correction, it's a slippery road to feeling, really disconnected or getting into a fight. Sarcasm and digs, obviously, just saying things like, making just a Barbie comment. It's like, I'm going to get a dig in on you and it's not a big deal. And we're basically on good terms, but I'm going to say, oh, I love the way that the dandruff looks on your coat. It really matches your purse, or, just something like that, like where it's sarcastic and it's too much edge sometimes. You have to read that though. If you're with someone who is cool with that, great. But if it's not landing, it's not going to support a healthy connection and it will leave people feeling bad a lot of the times. So if your spouse is telling you that and you're denying it and you're saying it's just not that big of a deal, you really have to listen. You have to listen to what they're saying doesn't land well and not insist on offering something that isn't landing well. That's crossing the line, and even if it's not overtly abusive, it's not helpful. And I would just say avoid it at all costs. Just eliminate that. Just decide that that's not something that you're going to do in your relationship. There's no reason for it. You're not really going to miss anything. It's not going to hurt your relationship. I also noticed that this is another losing strategy, is asking a question that's really just a statement, like, why did you do that? I'm just wondering, just tell me, why did you do that? And then if they answer you, they can't really answer it correctly, right? If they can't answer what you're asking correctly, it's not a real question. There's no way for them to win. Like, just tell me, why did you do that? I would never do that to you, right? If I'm asking the question just to show them that they were wrong, and I want to understand why they did it because I'm taking issue with it, and no answer that they give me could possibly explain it away or satisfy me, then it's not a real question. It's a statement that I'm just not saying. It's an experience or some feedback that I need to be offering, or some, transparency that I need to be offering. But instead of doing that, I'm going to ask them a question. And I guess you could consider this a rhetorical question. But I think a lot of times people don't think of this as a rhetorical question. They think of it as a real question. They think, if I could just understand it, then I wouldn't judge it. So please help me understand, why did you do that? Why did you not do that thing, right? But if everything they tell you is not satisfactory to you, you have to ask yourself, why am I actually asking this question? I'm really trying to make a point. So why don't I just make that point instead of battering them verbally in order to make that point, right? Because really the deeper intention is to show them how they're wrong. And it's just a no-win situation. It's not healthy. And then the last thing I want to mention in this gray area that could become abusive if it was chronic, but as a one-off is still a losing strategy, is when you poke holes on technicalities in what they're saying, or if you feel that your partner is poking holes in technicalities on what you're saying, when like purposely looking for something that they can take issue with, as opposed to listening to the spirit and intention behind what you're saying. It's almost like they're blocking the opportunity for connection, or you might be doing it. I mean, this goes to, either option. But anytime you're trying to poke holes in the premise of what somebody is trying to say, the intention is not connecting. The intention is not constructive. The intention is not healing. And so what is the intention? And that's really what it all comes down to. So for all of this, especially, verbal abuse is pretty clear what the intention is. But with emotional abuse and with this category of gray area, like hurtful comments or hurtful ways of responding to each other, the fastest way to break the cycle is to really get clear on what the intention is. Now, if you're the one doing it, if you're listening to this and you're like, I do that sometimes, then the antidote for you is to get very clear on what your intention is all the time. Like all the time, be thinking, even before you bring something up, before you respond, be clear inside your own self. And this is easier said than done, because we half the time are communicating unconsciously and we're not even aware of what our intentions are unless somebody asks us. So you want to get really good at wondering, what is my intention behind what I'm about to say or about what I'm about to ask? Is it to deconstruct? Is it to prove a point? Is it to be right? Is it to block a bid for connection? Is it to reject? Is it to retaliate? And to be really honest with yourself about what it is without judgment. Like, it's okay. It just recognize it and commit to not doing it anymore if you want your relationship to be better. You don't have to do this, but it will help your relationship. And if you're listening to this and you're somebody who is on the receiving end of this, then what you can do is you can ask your partner, if they start to cross a line and they start to like criticize you, or they start to take issue with you, or turn the tables on you, or ask rhetorical questions, or you feel baited by them, you can just ask them, like, what is it that you are wanting right now? What was the intention behind what you just said? What was the intention behind the question that you just asked? Give them that opportunity, like, to own it and to think about it and to get clear, because they're going to either own it, or they're going to deny it. And then if they deny it and it doesn't work for you, then you need to step out of the conversation. Um, don't engage with someone who is not aware of their own intentions to disconnect or to block an attempt at connection, whatever the case may be. And just decide, like, for yourself, I will only engage in communication that is productive and constructive, that allows us both to have our dignity. And anything that does not fit that criteria, as soon as I recognize that that's what's happening, I will step out of that. First, I will give a prompt, or I'll give a reminder. You are responsible for your own boundaries, because you can say to your spouse, and this is speaking to the question of, like, how do we get it to stop? How do we stop verbal or emotional abuse? The truth is that we can't stop anybody else from verbally abusing us. We can't stop anybody else from doing or saying what they're going to do. But what we can do, and we can communicate a boundary, but it's not going to work unless we hold it ourselves. It's up to us. Like, just communicating it is great. Like, okay, this is not okay with me. Fantastic. Now you've communicated what's not okay with you. What are you going to do the next time they cross the line? That's where the boundary gets held. And so you can be really clear, like, next time you do that, next time you ask me a rhetorical question, or next time you turn the tables on me, I will ask you what your intention is, or I will, call it out. And then if it still continues, or if I still feel like we're not getting anywhere, then I will accept that my attempt at having this communication isn't going to work right now. And so I'm going to step out of the conversation. I accept that this is how you're responding to me, and I won't engage it any further. And then you have to be aware of these things. You have to be mentally prepared, not to try to, like, avoid it and hope it doesn't happen, but almost to have the attitude of, like, bring it on. The next time that happens, I'm going to be ready, and I'm going to get an opportunity to practice it. So the problem is the opportunity. The problem is the opportunity to not stop it from happening, but to bring your light of awareness into the situation next time, so that you have a choice to respond differently. That is what's going to disrupt the pattern. That's what's going to catalyze transformation. It only takes 2 or 3 times of disrupting that, pattern that you might be in with your spouse, where it's not going to feed them anymore, especially if they're overtly abusive, and you're not feeding that anymore. And this is especially true if you think that your spouse is a narcissist. You don't want to supply them with your energy anymore, because they're getting something out of that. They're getting something out of one-upping you. They're getting something out of verbally thrashing you. They're getting something out of making you second guess at yourself and being, just like taking that superior stance. They have to be engaging you to get that hit. And so if you step out of it and withdraw your energy and attention, you won't be feeding it anymore. That's the first step. Now, I know that that's easier said than done, and I know that there's some of you listening to this that already get this, but the challenge is then you have to deal with your own emotions. Then you have to walk away without getting what you wanted from the conversation. Then you have to walk away with the acceptance of that didn't work. I didn't get what I wanted from that conversation. I didn't get the understanding I wanted. I didn't get the commitment I was hoping to get. I didn't get the healing or just the resolution that I was looking for. Now I have to go regulate myself around those feelings, to hold my own boundary, and to hold my own boundary, and to no longer feed the dynamic that isn't working for me anymore. So that's the hard part, because, the only way to stop verbal abuse and emotional abuse from being effective or being part of it at all, being on the receiving end of it at all, if you're in a relationship that has some potential, you will be able to disrupt that pattern. You will be able to disengage from it. And that person, if they're not pathologically narcissistic or abusive, they will adjust and they will find a new way to dance with you, and you will have a better relationship. But it's probably not going to come until you're willing to be uncomfortable first in saying, I know that this might be happening. I know that I can't necessarily stop it from happening, but I can prepare myself to recognize what it looks like, be ready for it, know for myself what are the situations where this might crop up, and then know how I'm going to respond and start practicing it. You can't just have an insight and expect that that's going to immediately translate to muscle memory, that you're immediately going to have it in your gut. Your whole body is now going to just follow suit from your insights, because we know that we have to practice anything to learn it. We have to build it into our muscle memory so that it becomes part of our programming, whether we're driving a stick shift or whether we're snowboarding or whether we're, learning any new skill of any kind. It takes practice, and it takes, failure. It takes trying and not succeeding so that you can find your way, find your balance, build the muscle memory, build the stamina. And you have to be willing to do that for a period of time. And then once you've cleaned up your side and you feel that it's still happening and you still feel like you're on the receiving end of emotional and verbal abuse, and you've cleaned up your side and you've held your own boundaries and it's still happening, then I think you have enough information to recognize what the limits are. But we don't know what the limits of a relationship are until we clean up our side 100%. Once we've done that, and we know, and that's uncomfortable, because then we have to be willing to be spoken to in a way we don't want to be spoken to, and not respond in a way that is not in alignment with our values. We have to take the high road. We have to go through that discomfort of like the gap between the time that you initiate a transformation and the time that it comes into fruition and manifests and becomes a daily part of your life. So that's it, you guys. I hope that this was helpful. I'm very curious to hear if you have any questions about this. I'm going to go to the group now and see if there's any questions that I can answer. Marie, yes, I'm glad it was helpful. And yes, there will be a replay. And it will be right in this group. So you can just replay it from this group. And if he's not in this group, then let me know. You can like message me, like PM me on Facebook. And what I'll do is I will send you the YouTube link, because I'll end up putting it on YouTube as well. But this group is a private group, so anybody that's not in it won't be able to listen to it unless they're in it. Any other questions, you guys? Okay, Mary, so what if the individual was brought up in an abusive home environment? Yes. Well, and this happens a lot, right? It's habit, and it doesn't mean the person is an abuser, but that is in their hardwiring of what they've been exposed to and what is normal. And so in that case, they have to be willing to do the work to learn new ways of communicating that are not abusive. And if you are on the receiving end of that, in the meantime, because we can't do another person's work for them, we can't control what another person says or does or what their intentions are or the level of self-awareness. But what we can do is recognize it the second it's happening, recognize the second that it's outside of what we've committed to creating for ourselves, and saying, okay, so this is happening right now. This is not okay with me. And give it, like, let that person know, basically. And I'm speaking generally now to apply to everybody, but basically let that person know that's not okay with me, and let's try that in a healthier way. Or here's how I'd like to talk about this conversation. Here's how I want to talk about it. Here's how I don't want to. Here's what I am willing to participate in this conversation. Here's what I'm not willing to participate in. And then if they keep doing it, then you have every right to just step out and say, I'm not responding. And that is very powerful. Like, just not responding, literally just not saying anything back, and letting just silence be the only response. And there's the complete removal of your attention and energy. Physical presence, mental presence is a very powerful response. You don't have to have the perfect words to say. You don't have to have the perfect, comeback line that will help them realize. All you have to do is say, hey, remember I said I wasn't going to engage that. For me, it was rhetorical questions. Hey, I'm not answering rhetorical questions. If you have something to say to me, please just say it. Whatever it is that you're trying to say, just say it. I will hear you, but I will not answer that rhetorical question. And then if it kept going, or if things escalated, then I would just leave. And what's best is if you can let them know ahead of time. Let the person know ahead of time, because if you're the one that's making the changes and you're the one that has a vested interest in the changes more than they do because it's working for them, but it's not working for you, then you have to be the one to hold that line for yourself. Come forward and say, hey, here's what I'm going to do from now on. I just wanted to give you a heads up. I did this with my mom. I was like, I just want to give you a heads up that it's not okay for you to criticize my children's appearance. And I can't control what you say, but if you do, I'm going to give you one reminder. And if you keep going with it, I'm leaving. I'm taking the kids and we're leaving. And I had to do that 3 times, and it was super inconvenient. I had to look like I was causing a drama. I had to look like, I had to follow through, and it sucked. It sucked. There was a big family gathering one time, and it was, everyone's like, what's wrong? And I just had to follow through because I said, this is what I'm going to do, and I have to do it. And it was embarrassing to me, but I knew that I had to follow through. I did it 3 times, and it hasn't happened since. And this is a narcissist too, by the way. The best thing you can do, and I have leverage because she wants contact with her grandkids, but I think that might not have worked if I didn't have that in my corner, and that might not apply in your situation. But I'm just sharing that as an example. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, so Mary, just to make sure I'm understanding. So if the individual is brought up in an abusive environment and seems to feed off the previous interactions, which previous interactions do you mean? The previous interactions in your conversation, or the previous interactions that are abusive in general in history? Which ones do you mean? And Greta, I'm going to see if I can answer your question too. Okay, so your husband, you separated from him because he was verbally abusive, and now he wants O10 therapy. That's great. He is going to have to get a significant amount of help to rewire himself and do some healing on his own. And so I would give it time. That takes time. And I would stay separated as he keeps working on it. Don't get pressured into coming back together in the same household just because he's in therapy. I think you want to have under your belt a lot of interactions where the old way would have happened, but now you see the new way is happening instead. Lots of times that support the new narrative before you get back under the same roof again. That would be my advice. Because people that tend to be abusive, they will, when they're in crisis and they feel that they've lost the person, that's when they'll do everything that they need to do to get the person back. But that's not what's going to create the change. What's going to create the change is his follow through, regardless of whether or not you're living under the same roof. His commitment needs to be for himself, and it needs to be consistent and sustainable. And you have to have proof of that. You have to have a lot of evidence of the new narrative before you could probably lean into it. But that said, you could look for that evidence and start compiling it. And once you feel like you have enough evidence, great. People can change. People can change. They can. I see it every day. If they want to, and they really want to do the healing, and they're willing to really look at themselves, and they're willing to own themselves, and not abusive people can absolutely heal. They can change as long as they're willing to take accountability and to be able to admit, I was being abusive. I see that was hurtful, and that was on me. It was 100% my fault. If they're still trying to make you responsible for something that they did that was abusive or said that was abusive, then that is not a good prognosis. So I hope that helps. Good. Good. I'm glad that he's doing that for your son. So one partner is brought up in an abusive environment and brings those patterns to the relationship in that they only know the old patterns. They have to learn new patterns. They just have to learn new patterns. They have to be willing to say, they have to be willing to hear and understand, this is not working anymore. This is not what I want anymore, even though it is hardwired into your psyche. It's not what's going to support our future relationship. And so And then that person ultimately has to do the work to learn the alternatives and start practicing the alternatives. A lot of times people who grew up in abusive homes shut down because they don't want to be abusive, but they just don't have any modeling, any template in their experience of knowing how to do things differently. And it's not that they don't want it to change, it's just they don't know how. So they swing really far to the other end of the pendulum. That's the word I was looking for. They swing really far to the other end, and they're like, I so badly don't want to say the wrong thing. I so badly don't want to hurt anybody. I so badly don't want to be abusive like my parents that I'm just going to keep things to myself and get really quiet. And that is a step in the right direction, but it is not where you want to end up. What you want ultimately is to be able to start practicing and integrating, sharing, and learning new ways. And that's absolutely possible. I see it happen every day. All right, you guys, I think that's it. If you have any other questions, let me know. I'm glad that was helpful, Greta. And for any of you that are listening later that have not been here live, I still will be coming back and going through the comments and answering any questions that come in here. Thanks for tuning in, you guys, and I'll see you next time.